Hello, students, and welcome to this podcast, which will cover our midterm in Film 240, Introduction to Film. What I'm going to do is go through the questions and offer sample answers. This can clarify for you why your midterm grade is what it is, insofar as I submitted those midterm grades last Friday, as required by the university. If you received an incomplete, that is because either the midterm or the scene description analysis was either not completed or missed the shot sufficient that we're going to need to develop an alternate path. For the scene description analysis, that's easy. You can revise and revise. For the midterm, there's a couple of options. If you're unhappy with your midterm grade, we can either A, have the final exam count for both the midterm and the final. Or, if you prefer, I can create another midterm with comparable but not identical questions, and you can take that. So let's begin. Question 1. Narrative is the relationship of plot and story. Plot is the sequence of episodes as they are shown in a film, while story refers more broadly to all of the events both implied and depicted and their presumed chronological sequence. Compare the relationship of plot and story in Cargo and Reagan in Kabul. What do their narrative structures contribute to each film? In this instance, it's chapters 2 and 4 that are going to be most meaningful because they both have to do with storytelling, narrative. Now, some films, like Cargo, have plot equaling story. The beginning of the movie is the beginning of the story as we know it. Now, we can anticipate backstory. We know, for example, that prior to the beginning of the story as depicted in the film, there must have been some kind of zombie infection, and this couple drove through a rural countryside, and his wife got infected, and he crashed the car. That's when the story begins and the plot begins, and they are equivalent through the duration of the 10-minute film. In contrast, for example, in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, that's what we call a frame story, where the beginning of the plot is actually towards the end of the story, and the majority of the film is an extended flashback to the events that precede the appearance of the main character at the asylum. The frame story concludes and the story concludes, the plot concludes when we discover that the main character is in fact a mental patient and Caligari is in fact the head of that facility. So in that instance, plot does not equal story. Now, for Reagan in Kabul, we would apply that understanding. Reagan in Kabul is constructed through its editing. Its plot and story are radically different. The first thing we hear is, "I hope you die over there," and it's not until much later in the film that we understand what that means, the last words he said to his son. There's also a flashback to the couple playing with their son when he's very young. So in a sense, that would be the earliest part of the story, the young man being a toddler. That's the first thing that happens in the story, the sequence of events in which they are presumed to have occurred in a real world. However, the first part of the plot is the voiceover, "I hope you die over there." So what this allows us to do is it becomes a kind of mystery as over the course of the 10-minute film, we piece together the story so that it makes sense to us, and that enriches our sense of loss. Also, it's problematized by the same actor playing both the student and the son. And also, of course, the racial difference between the son and the father. So we presume then either he's adopted, or to the man who's lost his son and his wife, he sees his son everywhere. Obviously, that's too long of a response, but that's the fullest response so that you could understand, you could write quite easily. Plot and story are equivalent in Cargo. The first thing we see at the beginning of the film is the first part of the story. There are no flashbacks or flash forwards, and the story proceeds in accordance with the plot. Reagan in Kabul, in contrast, is broken up into many different parts across a time frame. Later in the plot, we see the earliest part of the story, the son as a child. This allows us to piece together more actively the story of the film. Question 2. In filmmaking, who are responsible for design and composition in mise en scène? Provide a specific scene from one of our class films that demonstrates the importance of mise-en-scène. Okay, this obviously is covered in Chapter 5. In mise-en-scène, design is the responsibility of the production designer, working under the direction of the director. Composition is the responsibility of the director of photography, again, working under the direction of the director. For example, at the beginning of Rear Window, the camera tracks forward and we see the courtyard. That courtyard is actually not a location, it's a set. If you didn't know that and you assumed it was a location, that's fine. In that instance, the production designer decides what the courtyard should look like based on the direction of the director. Then a location scout either finds such a location or the production designer instructs the crew to build that set. In terms of composition, the director of photography looks through the camera lens and determines the movement of the camera as it pans and tracks as we survey the courtyard and the camera retreats back to the room. The importance of that scene is it establishes the locale, the setting, for almost the entire film. This courtyard is where everything happens. Question 3. What are the 3 stages of the filmmaking process? Who is involved in each, and how does the process apply to Rear Window? Well, I guess I probably should have used a different example for the prior question. The 3 stages of the filmmaking process are pre-production, production, and post-production. Pre-production involves the writing of the script, casting of the film, building of sets or scouting of locations. Production involves the recording of film, now mostly video, and the recording of sound, dialogue, natural sound, and any soundtrack or score. Post-production involves putting all of these pieces together, including primarily editing, sequencing the shots the editor does at the direction of the director, and also perhaps any re-recording that need be done. So the casting director at the direction of Hitchcock casts the film. The production designer designs the set. The director of photography shoots the film while other crew members record sound. And then the editor at the direction of Hitchcock edits and assembles the final film. Question 4. What is the genre of Yard of the Month? Which of our feature films is also of that genre? How are they similar and different? The genre of Yard of the Month is a comedy. Drama as a genre doesn't really mean that much. It just means stuff happens. It just means there's a story. Clearly, there's parts of Yard of the Month which are driven to make us laugh, the definition of a comedy. You could understand this from the section on genre in Chapter 3 of our textbook. The feature film it most closely resembles in terms of that genre would be Charlie Chaplin's The Gold Rush. And while, of course, Chaplin's film The Gold Rush is a feature, while Yard of the Month is a short, both are in black and white, and while The Gold Rush is a silent film and features only occasional intertitles for dialogue, Yard of the Month does rely primarily on its visual storytelling and its soundtrack, featuring very minimal dialogue. The causes, of course, of the difference are one's a short film, one's a feature, one's made in 1925, the other in 2014. Question 5. What are some of the non-diegetic elements of The Jap Room and Yard of the Month? What do they contribute to the films? Now, non-diegetic and diegetic are drawn from our glossary, both in our syllabus and in the glossary of our textbook. Diegetic is that which happens in the world of the story on screen. Non-diegetic are elements external to that. As such, in The Jap Room, the old woman's voiceover isn't happening in the moment, it's her remembering. And so that voiceover narration is extra diegetic. In Yard of the Month, the soundtrack is the extra diegetic element. There is not bluegrass music playing when the father and the son go to the store and buy yard equipment or mow the lawn. However, it does offer some rapid pacing and allows the editing to be the editing can be a bit disjointed, but it's sutured together, it's brought together by the coherence of the accompanying song, which also gives us a kind of comic feel and a sense of the rural setting. Question 6. What is unusual about the narrative structures of City of God and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari? What do they contribute to how audiences might respond to them? Well, as I mentioned before, both are frame stories. And again, narrative structure, the relationship of plot and story, is covered pretty thoroughly in chapters 2 and 4 of our textbook. You could also draw from chapter 3 to point out their respective differences in terms of genre. While The City of God features some horrific violence, it's not a horror film. It is a documentary-style coming-of-age film of a young man. Like the Captain of Dr. Caligari, it's a frame story. The first thing we see in the plot is actually one of the last things that will happen in the story. As such, their narrative structure, where the plot begins near the end of the story, and then in an extended flashback we see subsequent development of the characters and their relationships and the outcome of the plot, and then that plot merges with where the story has developed later in the originally young boy's life, now a young man. In terms of how audiences might respond to them, both require a little unpacking. Both require an active and engaged audience to piece together how what we're seeing on the screen makes sense. Question 7. What are the explicit and implicit meanings of The Gold Rush and City of God? What do their implicit meanings have in common? Well, explicit and implicit meanings are parts of chapters 1 and 2 in our textbook. Explicit meanings are what we see play out on screen, that folks who watch the movie can agree that The Gold Rush begins with the tramp and Big Jim seeking gold. They encounter their antagonist. The tramp falls in love, and in the end, the tramp becomes rich and sees Georgia, his love, again on the ship. City of God's explicit meaning: a young boy grows up in the slums of Brazil. In terms of their implicit meanings, this is an interpretation, but it's a dominant interpretation. So there's no evidence to say that the Gold Rush is an extended metaphor for the fall of the German Empire in World War I. There's just no evidence for that. A young, plucky, poor guy finds his future and becomes rich. In City of God, a young, plucky, poor boy finds success and a way to get out of the slums, and each one of them finds love. Now, question 8, as indicated, is worth half the overall points. This was available in the instructions, and the instructions were available prior to beginning the exam. So, whereas the previous questions prompted you to answer in 2 or 3 sentences, here we're looking for a 3-paragraph essay. So your first option, choose 3 specific scenes from 3 of our course films from different eras, 1915 to 29, 1930 to 60, after 1960. So first you have to choose the 3 films you want to focus on, the ones you know best. Probably you're going to go with Cabinet of Dr. Caligari or Gold Rush, then probably Rear Window, then perhaps City of God. Now we compare and contrast the scenes, so we have to choose specific scenes, one scene from each of these movies, and compare and contrast them in terms of their mise-en-scène and their genres. What are the causes and consequences of their similarities and differences in terms of production, filmmakers, and reception, audiences? So let's say we're going to choose these 3 films: Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Rear Window, City of God. Next, we want to get some sense of what our overall point is. We know that these films differ primarily because they're from very different moments in film history. As such, aspects of their look and feel change. So black and white, of course, for Captain of Dr. Caligari, somewhat overly bright colors in Rear Window, and some rather explicit violence in City of God, and its frenetic, kinetic, rapid-fire editing. So, specific scenes from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Rear Window, and City of God demonstrate changes in production and reception. across important eras of film history. That paragraph continues. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a horror film, though it's not as gory as, indeed, it's not gory at all in comparison with contemporary films. Later, we'll learn that that's because when the rating system is instituted in 1968, prior to that, effectively every film was rated G. But you wouldn't include that because that's not until a later chapter. So the genre of psychological horror for the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari lends itself to its dark mise-en-scène, what our book will later describe as German Expressionism. The stark black and white shadows, the creepy nature of the somnambulist, the creepy nature of Caligari, who uses the somnambulist to murder his enemies. The look and feel of the specific scene, for example, when the somnambulist attacks the young woman, where he holds the knife and looks at her, is prepared to kill her, but then there's a close-up of his face and we see his eyes seem to turn to lust. We see a very different scene in the color of Rear Window's introduction of Grace Kelly's character. She enters the dark apartment and lights a series of lamps as she pirouettes from one to the next. The mise-en-scène focuses on her. The camera's gaze at her matches Jeffrey's gaze at her, just as César gazed at the object of his interest. However, of course, it is in color, and it's a much more romantic scene. While this film is also a thriller, here in this instance, there is this moment of romantic engagement between the two main characters. In City of God, we might choose the opening scene where there's a chicken, and in rapid fire editing, which is very distinct from the mise-en-scène of the prior two scenes, the sequences of the prior two scenes, the rapid fire editing gives us a very challenging sense of figuring out exactly where we are. It takes us a while to piece together the separate shots. There's a chicken, the chicken's running, people are chasing the chicken, and then we see there's a young man. And we realize the chicken is being pursued by these gangsters in the same way that this young man is being pursued by the gangsters. All three are thrillers, but their mise-en-scène casts them in very different light, and the audiences receiving these films accepted them very differently. Silent film audiences of the 19-teens and 20s are prepared to watch a silent film in a way that film audiences of Rear Window and film audiences of City of God are going to, in most cases, be far less patient, especially college student audiences, I've found. The second prompt offers list 3 of our course films that are different genres and from different time periods, and explain how their respective genres and time periods shape their fundamental differences. So the question is similar to the first, but rather than invite you to focus strictly on genre and mise-en-scène, it encourages you to focus on genre and time periods. So in this case, from distinct time periods, we might choose the Gold Rush, again, Rear Window, and this time we'll go with Cargo. The Gold Rush, Rear Window, and Cargo are very different films in terms of genre and in terms of the historical time of their production. The Gold Rush is a comedy designed to make us laugh, a silent film relying on the camera being the central narrator of the film, with only occasional intertitles listing dialogue. Because it's made in 1925, it's in black and white. Because it's made in 1925, it features no synchronic sound. In the 1950s, audiences were more prepared for films that are in color and feature synchronic sound. Indeed, they virtually demand it, at least for the sound. Black and white would not really fade out entirely until the 1960s. As a romantic and psychological thriller, it has a different purpose. It's not trying to make us laugh, though there may be occasional funny moments. It's trying primarily to get us invested in these two characters and seeing as we see through Jeffrey's eyes and through his camera, we're drawn into the mystery. Did the neighbor kill his wife or not? So as a mystery, we discover, in effect, what happens at the beginning of the story at the end of the plot. This is the nature of all mysteries. The nature of the genre of the mystery is at the end of the plot, you find out the first thing that happened in the story, the murder that was committed. However, again, made in the 1950s, the film does not feature the actual dismembered body or the act of the murder itself, because that was not part of the sensibility of the 1950s United States. In the 21st century film Cargo, its genre is a little tricky. We'd recognize it as part of the subgenre of the zombie film, which typically is horror. However, this 21st take on the zombie film operates very differently. Conventionally, zombie films are pretty nihilistic, action-driven, and very gory and horrific. It's literally people eating other people most often. This one turns much of those conventions while using them, but turns them on their head. This 21st century take on the zombie film treats an audience that knows the rules of the zombie film, but then treats them differently, ending instead on a message of hope and salvation. Now, in grading the midterms, in order to post midterm grades last week, I haven't listed them in Blackboard yet, but what I noted is the folks who completed the midterm successfully first followed the instructions carefully, keeping the first 6 of 7 questions to less than a paragraph, but more than a sentence, and using terms from our textbook and examples from our films. The students who completed the midterm most successfully also recognized, having read the instructions, that the final question, worth 30 points, and thus half of the overall 60, merited 3 paragraphs of 6 to 8 sentences each instead of just 2 or 3 sentences. And again, those most successful essay responses incorporated critical terms from our glossary, from our course reading, and mentioned specific scenes from our course films. Also, the students who did best on the midterm and the scene description analysis, again, followed the instructions very carefully, were most active in class discussion, especially referring to, in lengthier entries, our course reading and viewing and drawing connections between them. Also, the folks who proved most successful made the effort to contact me by phone, as I have encouraged folks to do frequently throughout our semester thus far. So, if you are disappointed with your midterm grade, that's okay. We've got plenty of time to fix it. I'm going to be very flexible. If you decide to take a second midterm, we can work that out after fall break. If you decide to have your final exam count for both the final exam and the midterm, that's fine too. If you decide to continue to revise your scene description analysis, that's great. The most important thing for doing so is to first read the assignment that's in the syllabus, then carefully review the sample scene description analyses that I've posted to Blackboard course content. What you want to do is follow those instructions meticulously so that your one-page, single-spaced, 12-point Times New Roman scene description analysis is such that you could, if it were printed on paper, you could take the top, fold it down to the bottom, make a small crease, and that crease would be roughly proximate to the shift from your paragraph or paragraphs on description to your paragraph or paragraphs on analysis. Furthermore, the first 2 or 3 sentences would introduce the film, who made it, the year of release, its plot, including its conclusion, and then as quickly as possible get us to the particular scene. That first paragraph or 2 should feature as many film terms as you can possibly imagine using. The second paragraph shifts from the explicit meaning to the implicit meaning. Also, that second the analysis section needs to include a comparison of the scene to another from our course films and a mention of an incorporation of a quote from our textbook. All of this has been available to you since the first day of class, or at least all of the instructions have been. Each week I've posted additional course content for that week. I know that some of you are frustrated. Most of you signed up to take this class face-to-face. I would far prefer to be in a classroom talking to you. and answering your questions immediately instead of very slowly via email or podcasts. However, because of the pandemic, there is just not a room large enough for 25 of us to be in that room socially distant such that we can be safe. I would be really frustrated if I signed up for a face-to-face class and instead was in an online class. It sucks. So we can try to help fix this by, I will make more podcasts so that you can listen along. You can listen to them while you're driving, running errands, doing other things, cleaning the house, whatever. The closed captioning will allow you to read along if that works better for you. Also, if you're facing a challenge in an assignment or concepts from the book, class discussion can help. Don't just fill out your 150 to 300 words. Go back and read what other people have said towards the end of the week, and you'll like a good class session face-to-face. You can learn from each other and not just from the book and from me. When in doubt, read the syllabus, go to course content, Google it, and then just call me, 803-979-8577. Thanks, and have a great day and a great fall break.